All right, Alexander, let's talk about the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping and the alliance, but we can't call it an alliance between Russia and China, even though it is, in my opinion, an alliance. But no one has really talked about India's place in all of this and India's reaction to this growing partnership. Let's call it growing partnership between China and Russia. What does India say to
Yeah,
all of
it has
this?
been very, very interesting. And we've now had two senior Indian diplomats giving their comments about the Sino-Russian, the Chinese-Russian summit in Moscow. One is M.S. Badrakumar, who writes for Indian. He writes his blog, Indian Punchline. He's an interesting and very, very well-informed commentator. The other is a gentleman, a much more senior diplomat or former diplomat, who was the Foreign Secretary of India in the early 2000s. Now, I referred to him in my own program as India's foreign minister. He was never apparently foreign minister. He was a career diplomat who rose to the highest position within the Indian Foreign Service. And India's Foreign Service is, as you should know, you come from a diplomatic family of a very, very high caliber indeed. And the Foreign Secretary, the highest diplomat within that Foreign Service, is a very influential person in shaping Indian foreign policy. And this individual who's given written this long article, he is somebody whose words, I am sure, still carry a huge amount of weight today. Now, the interesting thing is, these two articles, both of which I've discussed on my channel, they're essentially saying the same thing. They're saying India may have problems with China, but we don't need to stress or change our policy because our friend Russia is getting so close to China. Because this isn't really about us. The Russians aren't going to side with China against us. The Russians are remaining our friends. This relationship between the Chinese and the Russians is purely about the US. So we don't need to be worried about it. Now, the more interesting of those two articles came from this foreign secretary because he made, I thought, some astonishing points. India currently chairs the G20. The Indians are being told by the US, by Blinken, that when there is the G20 summit in Delhi in September, the United States is going to insist that all of the documents that are issued from this G20 summit condemn Russia. And the Indians are saying, well, look, that's impossible. Russia is itself a member of the G20. They will refuse to sign off on any statement or communique that condemns themselves. It's clear that the Chinese aren't going to sign any such documents either. So what you are doing is you're guaranteeing that there will be no final communiques or statements issuing out of the G20 summit. And if you do that, then the summit will basically fail, and we, as the chair, will be humiliated. And besides, we don't want to go down this road of condemning the Russians in the way that you do, because we have a good relationship with them. And what they're finding is that the US, Blinken to be precise, because he's the person who's speaking to the Indians, he is immovable. He insists, he's continuing to say, this is what the US insists upon. We don't care whether there's final statements or communiques or not. We're not prepared to sign off on anything that doesn't fully reflect our views. And by the way, if the summit meeting in Delhi ends without communiques or a final communiques or a statement, well, as far as we're concerned, that really doesn't matter. We still think that the G20 can survive, and that all sorts of useful things can still be talked about and discussed at this meeting, even if there is no final statement or communique. Well, the Indians apparently are horrified by this attitude. And this article by this Indian Foreign Secretary, he made the point. Essentially, the point he's making is, you have two countries, India and Russia. They're very close friends. They've been friends for a very long time, ever since India gained independence from Britain in the 1940s. It's a relationship which is treasured and valued highly by both of these countries. Now, over the last couple of years, last 10 years or so, Russia has tilted increasingly towards China. India has to some extent tilted towards the US. The reason is that India has a difficult relationship with China, problems with China. Russia has only possibly awful relationship with the United States. So they've each tilted towards the adversaries of, of their adversaries, if you like. Now, the difference is the Chinese are not asking the Russians to side with them against India. So the result is that the relationship between Russia and China is frictionless. The Russians can preserve their friendship with India. The US, by contrast, is putting pressure on India to side with the US against Russia. So the result of that is that the relationship between India and the US is becoming more difficult, and that there are frictions starting to grow. What you see, again, is US foreign policy, Blinken's conduct of US foreign policy is creating problems. It is slowly pushing India away.
Yeah, one side is foreign policy run by adults and professionals, and the other side is foreign policy run by children and amateurs. Yes. And Blinken is an amateur. He really is an amateur. They need help, Alexandra. The U.S. State Department, people like Blinken, the Biden White House, I mean, they really need an intervention. This has become a sickness, this obsession with Ukraine. It seeps into every single thing they do. Every decision they make now, foreign, domestic, hinges on Ukraine. I mean, you can't run a country like this. You can't run a foreign policy like this. It's destroying the United States.
This is absolutely true. I mean, look, just take your mind back and look at what they did with Turkey. I mean, 10 years ago, I was coming out saying, all this talk about, Turkey distancing itself from the US. It's not going to happen. Same with Saudi Arabia. 10 years ago, who would have thought that Saudi Arabia would align away from the US? The Saudis, by the way, have just published a vicious video. I mean, it really is. It's very funny, actually, but ridiculing Biden. That's the Saudis. That's America's Middle East friend. And the trouble is that the US, especially this administration, more this administration than any other that I can think of, just doesn't understand. You can't just push people around all the time. You've got to listen to them. So when the Indians say, look, we place great value on this summit meeting. This G20 is important for us. No, we're not going to arrest Putin if he comes to Delhi. We're not even part of the Rome Statute. Don't ask us to do that. Don't ask us to condemn our Russian friends. We don't agree with you. He won't listen. He insists that they do all of those things. And the Indians are therefore faced with a collapse of their summit. And who are they going to be angry with? They're going to be angry with the US. And it's going to push India away. You can already see that. The Indians are buying oil from the Russians. They're doing deals with the Russians. before long, they're going to start to say, this relationship with the US, it just isn't worth it. And perhaps, just possibly, the right thing for us to do is to start to look for ways. It's going to be very difficult. There's lots of accumulated problems, but let's look for a way to sort out our relations with the Chinese. After all, we're members of the BRICS. We're joining the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Let's try and find a way to get back to the relationship with the Chinese which we had in the 50s, when India and China were very close friends. So, that's where this is heading if this continues in this way. And I read, there was a very interesting article that I read which referenced an interview that Hillary Clinton gave way back in 2021, in which she said that when she was in the State Department, everybody was saying there's no possibility of a real Russian-Chinese alignment because the Russians are so worried about their eastern borders, about the Chinese colossus, to their southeast, that they'll always in the end come to terms with the US, and well, we see how that worked out. So if people in Washington think that ultimately India is so worried about China that it will always ally itself with the United States, well, history, experience says otherwise. You can't make those kind of assumptions, nor should you in diplomacy, if your diplomacy is professionally run, which that of the US is not.
Yeah, well, they said the same thing about Saudi Arabia and Iran, didn't they?
Exactly. And
now
look
what's happening. Saudi Arabia was trying to regime change Assad, and now they're reopening their consulate.
Exactly.
Same is going to happen with Turkey and Syria, and I'm watching speech after speech from many leaders in the global South. I think yesterday the leader of Kenya said we need to find ways to ditch the dollar. I'm seeing CNN reporters like Fareed Zakaria, who did a whole segment talking about how the U.S. dollar is collapsing on the world stage, and people are dropping in, and he's like, if this happens, we're done.
Yes.
We're done. This is Fareed Zakaria. This is no friend of say Putin, Trump, Xi Jinping side of things. This guy's a Biden White House loyalist, and he's saying this. The writing's on the wall, but the State Department, the Biden White House can't. No. They refuse to see it. They refuse to see it because everything that they do is about Ukraine. Everything they eat, sleep, drink, walk, talk, run Ukraine. I mean, it's on their mind 24/7, and Putin is on their mind 24/7.
Well, as we've discussed many times, obsessions are always dangerous things, and they always lead to bad counsels and bad decisions. And I'm afraid it's not just the US. Once upon a time, long ago, well, not so long ago, I mean, I can remember the time when the US's European allies, would work to try and calm the situation. I remember, Helmut Schmidt and Chirac and Mitterrand and Giscard d'Estaing. I remember, during the time of, the Afghan crisis in 1979, the Polish crisis in 1981, I think it was. Real leaders, they'd come along and say, look, let's calm down a little, because some Americans, let's be frank, can get overexcited sometimes, but, their real leaders would come along, they'd say, calm down, take a step back. It's not quite as bad as you think. We still got to keep talking to these people, even if we don't like them. And unfortunately, all of those leaders have gone. We have the Ursulas, we have the Michels, we have the Borrells, we have the Habecks, the Baerbocks, all of them. And I mean, they are, instead of providing good counsel. Margaret Thatcher did the same. As I said, I can remember, you always think of her as an arch hawk, but she was, in the 80s, she was often a force of restraint. What they do instead is they're egging America on all the time. They're, in fact, amplifying the voices in the US that call continuously for confrontation, undercutting the many real voices in the US which say, look, we need to take a step back, we need to start doing diplomacy again, we need to talk more respectfully to the Indians, understand that they have a point of view, understand that they have a right to have a point of view, and look at what our real strengths are and what our limits are, understand that the dollar really does matter, the reserve currency status of the dollar does matter, and that ultimately putting everything in jeopardy because we got this fixation with one man, Putin, and one country, Russia, is not good politics, it's not good diplomacy, it's leading us not so much down a blind alley, but straight over the cliff.
Yeah, just a final note. I don't know if you agree, but I think a lot of this obsession with Putin and Ukraine is personal for a lot of people in power in the collective West, and this is a huge problem. I was reading some of the tweets that the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas put out the other day, and she's connecting the conflict with Ukraine and going after Russia, the sanctions on Russia. She's connecting it to her family
Yes.
history. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a very dangerous path for a leader to go down when you make this so personal, especially a tiny country like Estonia and a massive country like Russia. And you look past Kaja Kallas, and then you look at Ursula von der Leyen, and you look at Nuland and Chrystia Freeland, and even
Yes.
Biden. Even Biden, there's something about Biden and the Biden family that makes their hatred of Russia
Yes.
personal.
Yes.
There is a
Yes.
personal aspect to the Biden family and Russia, which is really consuming them. So a lot of this is very personal to them, and they're destroying
Yeah.
their countries and their societies because of this personal family history vendetta thing that they've got tied up in
I
their heads.
entirely agree. And can I just say, when you're thinking like that, when you have that kind of outlook, then you ought to step aside. You're not able to exercise statesmanship if you're so personally engaged in some issue. You have to be able to park those things. I mean, German leaders of once upon a time, Helmut Schmidt, whom I remember well, he was Chancellor of Germany at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. He had been a Luftwaffe officer during the Second World War. And of course, Germany and the Soviet Union had been enemies at that time. But whatever his personal feelings, about which I know little, by the way, little to the point of nothing, he didn't let that cause him to develop some kind of visceral hatred of the Russians, some desire to avenge some, bad result. And it's the same is true of any good leader. You've got to put the past, let the past be the past. Look at the situation in the present and do what is right and best to preserve peace and for your country and for your people today. Now, can I just say, in Biden's case, there's this story that's floating around that Biden and Putin had this big row in 2011, that Biden was sent by Obama to Moscow to tell Putin not to stand for the Russian presidency, but Obama wanted it to be Medvedev again, and Putin basically told Biden to get lost. Decisions in Russia are made in Russia, not in Washington. And Biden took umbrage. I think there is a lot of truth to that, but I think the fundamental reason, I'm going to be utterly straightforward about this, is that I think that, well, let's say that members of his family didn't get the business deals in Russia that they might have wanted. I think that's really what it's all about at the end of the day.
That's in character with the Biden family. Yeah, definitely. For them, for the Biden family, it is about power, but it always seemed like it was just more about making a quick buck. Where I think like the Clinton family was about making a lot of money, but it was also about obtaining
Absolutely.
a lot of power. Or the Obama family as well. For the Biden family, it seems like, yeah, they want the power, they like the power, but if you can just make a quick buck here and there, that's just much better.
Absolutely.
They're a much lower level outfit than the Clintons and the Obamas or the Bushes. I mean, that's my impression of Biden.
That's my impression also. Notice, interestingly, as I said, lots of talk about the Bidens and Ukraine, lots of talk about the Bidens and China, nothing about the Bidens and Russia. And that is interesting, and it does beg a lot of questions. And it does make me wonder whether because I can't imagine they didn't take some interest in that country, whether they did and they were told to stay out. And this has been one of the reasons why we have this anger, which has continued ever since. Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, just a final thought. You know that the Biden family, they get really upset when Bill Clinton is making $500,000 to speak for Alpha Bank in Russia, and they're probably saying, "Well, where's our $500,000?"
Exactly.
Exactly. We can send Hunter to speak at a banking function too. Give him $500,000, and they're not getting it.
That's anyway. Look, I mean, I don't know this, but it seems consistent with everything else. Let me put it like this.
Yeah. All right. We'll leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Rockfin, Odyssey, BitChute, and Telegram. And go to Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code Good Day. Take care.